If you've been following this channel for long enough, you'll know that a lot of the reason my channel was originally found by audiences was my coverage of the Batman Arkham series. Now, over the years, as these games have gotten older and we've moved away from the 2015 release of Batman Arkham Knight, now into new original games like Gotham Knights in its own universe and even Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, which is reportedly in that Arkham-verse. As we've moved further away, people have often asked me, hey, what do you think about this? What are your thoughts on the end of that series, at least for now, and how would you have done it differently? Now, first, I do want to say I'm not a complete narcissist, and I am not a game developer. I do have friends in the game industry. I know how potentially hard this job is. It usually requires lots and lots of people and moving parts working together, and it's far more difficult than just some jerk off in his house pitching a game. So I completely understand that. However, as a fan of this series, I have given it a lot of thought of how I would have continued this series if I was given complete control over it and the ability to pitch a game or two to Warner Brothers or someone else who wanted to make this game. And because of that, today I wanted to talk about this. And the first thing I want to say is that I would actually make 2 more games in this franchise. Now, many consider the original Arkham trilogy to be Asylum, City, and Night, with Origins sitting off on the side. I would actually begin by restructuring that public perception by introducing another WB Games Montreal game after Origins, but set before Arkham Asylum, while simultaneously beginning development on a rock-steady follow-up to Arkham Knight. The reason I say this is because I do believe that this is a universe with a lot of potential, and I do believe this is a universe that really could be expanded on, could get many other superheroes in the universe actually doing things and getting their own games, and building a shared universe kind of off the back of that connected Batman mythos. But since we're talking about the Batman Arkham series itself, I think it would be a little disingenuous to pop in with, I would have made a game about the Question in the Arkham timeline for this one. I think that's something for a different day. That's why this is also potentially difficult for me to outline, as I would be continuing the franchise with 2 new games that would essentially separate the trilogies and the perception of what the Arkham trilogy actually is. I do believe that both Origins and Asylum, as well as the events following for the entire franchise, could actually benefit by a game taking place between the two, because there are a handful of years there, as well as introducing or at least establishing connections between multiple characters that were either rushed, given the short end of the stick, or, otherwise just not included. So in this video, I'll be detailing my ideas for the first game taking place between Origins and Asylum, and then in a future follow-up video, I'd like to talk about my other ideas for a game taking place after Night. So if you enjoy this, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more content. This might be a little bit of a long one, but I'm going to do my best to be thorough and explain my ideas. Keep in mind, though, I do have a degree in writing. I'm not a huge credentialist, and there are writers far better than me. This is really just an outline pitch. There are not tons of dialogue specifics in this. In terms of the meat of the game, with the Arkham Origins sequel, I would make sure that Batman is well entrenched in his war on crime and much more experienced than in Origins, but far less than he is in Arkham Asylum. The same logic will go for most of his technology in the game as well, and I would pair him up with Dick Grayson, but have the two actually split and go their separate ways sometime in the middle of the story. I think it would be really interesting to have these single-player, 2-character encounters come back like they were in Arkham Knight, where you could have to tackle a situation with Dick Grayson's Robin or the Bruce Wayne Batman, and have them sort of work together and have their relationship be strained over the course of the story. You could both build up that relationship and strain it in the same story, and actually enrich the lore of the Dick Grayson that we see later on in the games. We do know that Dick Grayson was actually introduced a little bit after Arkham Origins' single-player story, as there is a canon outfit for him as Robin in the multiplayer of that game, which takes place after the single-player story mode of Batman Arkham Origins. So we do know that he eventually shows up. Obviously, it's not like he just comes out of nowhere as Nightwing. He was Robin in this universe. but I do think it would be very interesting to kind of tackle part of his story, but I wouldn't end it there. Partway through the game, I think it would be very interesting to introduce the character of Jason Todd. One of the biggest problems I have with Arkham Knight was that Jason Todd was very rarely alluded to in any fashion in previous games, other than a throwaway line here or there, like Joker's joke about "didn't I kill you already?" And this made the inclusion of his tragedy not as impactful to me as it could have been, and I still love it, but a lot of people do view Arkham Knight as diet under the Red Hood. This was not a character that we had seen in this universe before, and so the only buildup we really had to this tragedy around him was what was presented in the entirety of Arkham Knight, which was also really concerned with wrapping up a lot of different storylines, as well as tackling the Jason Todd material. Sadly, this made the reveal that the Arkham Knight was Jason Todd very blatantly obvious, especially once you're at the point of the game of Panessa Studios, to most players, despite the statements from Rocksteady previously saying that that wouldn't be the case, that Arkham Knight was a new original character. Lawyers speak, technically they were not lying, but also it's one of those things where it was very obviously done to skirt around the truth of who this character was. By introducing Jason Todd in my game, we would essentially be able to establish the player's reason to actually care about why what happened to him years later really mattered beyond just the little bit of backstory we get in that game. And also, this would show how Bruce was in a bit of a bind after losing Dick Grayson. This could be very similar to the storyline in the comics or even the DC animated universe, but with its own unique flair, where Batman essentially has to take in a new protege, though he would be reluctant to do so. He often feels that he needs help as Batman, but he does have an issue with trying to not endanger the Bat family around him, and we do see this in Arkham, where people do get hurt in his crusade on crime, in his pursuit to actually protect Gotham. That's just something that happens. It happens in pretty much every version of the character, and we do know that with bringing in Jason Todd, it's almost like a bittersweet feeling. We would know where it leads eventually, that Batman needed this help and that this person needed him, but it would eventually end in a tragedy for the character. This game could very easily end with the reveal of Jason Todd becoming the new Robin, and it would be easy to work previously established characters into the game. For example, there are characters we know that Bruce didn't really see for about 10 years-ish, and there are other side characters that really never appeared in this time period, and others that did. And it's also confusing because you do have a lot of comics in this time period, but they're pretty much mostly all considered non-canon because a lot of them do actually conflict with game materials. So it's kind of one of those things where I think it would be better to just move forward in that direction and try and bring in a character like Prometheus, which I think would be a perfect villain to see in this game, especially because he was already teased in previous games. I would personally like to see Prometheus as the main villain of this game, as he is actually an anti-Batman character that's been established in the comics as a real threat in the past, and he's also shown in this universe to exist and have a very deadly background. It could be interesting to play the story off of the connection between Batman and Prometheus. Batman was created because his parents were gunned down in an alley for really no reason right in front of him. This trauma affected Bruce Wayne and turned him into the person he is today. He's had to cope over the years, and he's had to try and build something constructive out of it that often does still have destructive ends and results within it, which is the Batman persona. At the same time, Prometheus's parents were a dark reflection of this. They were criminals themselves. They were still his mother and father, though. Prometheus watched the same thing happen that Bruce did, but through a different lens, as his parents were murdered in front of him by police officers. Witnessing this tragedy, instead of making him hate crime and criminals in an attempt to make the world a better place, Prometheus hated law enforcement. He hated this order, this thing that took his family away from them. Bruce Wayne is sort of a reflection of Prometheus, just as Prometheus is this dark reflection of Batman. It would be very easy to tie these two characters' tragedies together, especially if you created a Prometheus who was intelligent enough to put the pieces together either on who Batman was, or if you did the opposite as Batman, where Batman discovered the backstory of Prometheus throughout the course of the game, and you played the two off of each other in a sympathetic light. It would create a villain that Batman really understands and connects with, but who does not have the humanity to connect back with and understand Batman. This would be a very interesting plot point that could also drive a wedge very easily between an aging Dick Grayson Robin, dealing with his own trauma and issues and lifestyle, and a Batman still trying to end this war on crime and make Gotham a better place, who hasn't accepted that it could go on for the rest of his life or end with him dead. Now, obviously, we know how Arkham Knight ends, but it's important to remember these characters do not yet. You could very easily also tie in a variety of side characters or other Bat family members, including Barbara Gordon developing as Batgirl, as this would be prior to the tragedy that involved Joker putting her in a wheelchair, and you could also show the escalation of Joker over the course of this game. He could very easily be in the game like he is in Arkham City, except he does not steal the entire plot line. In Arkham City, I'm assuming that you've played the game, obviously the end does revolve around Joker, but Joker has a fairly constant presence in the game, especially through audio recordings, calls, and other stuff, along with dialogue of different characters, but he's not showing up at every turn to steal that narrative. He really kind of just encapsulates it by the end of the game. I think this would be a very interesting way to do it again. However, I think I would try to avoid just making the big bad at the very end Joker. I don't think, though, you can put a game in this time period without him. He's very, very important and especially central to the plot lines of the Arkham universe, and I think that when you try and move past him too quickly, especially in a game taking place between Origins and Asylum, it would be very easy to lose a little bit of that character's influence on that trilogy of us. Asylum obviously came out first, but then you have Origins and this game after it taking place between Origins and Asylum. I also do think that it would be very easy to work that character in as a side villain, make his presence constantly felt in the city throughout the game, like I said before, but be careful with it so that it doesn't actually steal the show. This is very similar to how someone like Two-Face was done in Arkham City, except that I would definitely give Joker a little bit more prominence than that, since he is the Joker. This is a selling point of this universe, and that relationship between Bruce Wayne and the Joker is a very big part of who the character is. When we start talking about relationships, I think there's one that's very important to weave into the storyline, which is Catwoman. Catwoman should also be playable and should have a handful of gadgets that make her feel useful and not like a nerfed version of Batman. She was done very well in previous games with her gameplay, as it seemed sort of sexy and sultry and sleek, and she seemed very intelligent and very, very driven, and she moved like a cat. I would bring that back, that essential gameplay style, but I would also tie in the romance between her and Batman. I think that it's a bit of a shame that it's not actually tied in very well into the Arkham storyline, this romance that's very clearly present between these characters in City and Night, and instead we just sort of see a more aloof, sexually interested in each other version of the characters, but that aren't really connecting on any sort of heart-to-heart basis. We do see a little bit of that in something like Arkham Origins Blackgate, where we get to see a little bit more of a personality-driven Catwoman. But being honest, most people didn't actually play this game, and it's very, very different from a normal Arkham game anyways. I think it would really help build up to that character in later games to get to see a more human side of Selina Kyle and this sort of love dynamic between her and Bruce Wayne. It'd be very interesting to see Batman actually trying to wrap his head around pursuing some sort of romantic-ish relationship with Catwoman during this time. For the stress of the story with Prometheus, perhaps some sort of tragedy in the story as well, and the turmoil with Dick Grayson, all playing into why this relationship didn't go anywhere permanently, but became an off and on again fling until Batman's disappearance at the end of Arkham Knight. I also do believe that this would again add impact to this character. This is something I have a big problem with at parts of these games, as we often see hints of their relationship, and also this would add more depth to Selina Kyle herself, but we don't actually get to explore her that deeply in other games she appears in. She's almost more of like a side inclusion or a treat to see her in those games. I really think she should take a central stage role in a very large and sprawling, city-driven story. I do believe there are multiple ways that you could use this relationship to tie into the tragedy of other games, including Talia al Ghul in Batman Arkham City. First off, thematically, seeing Batman attempt a relationship with another costume character and have that fall through would show you that Bruce has had a very terrible time in this department of his life. His persona as Batman essentially swallows up a lot of his social life and the priorities in his life like a black hole, while he's doing his absolute best to not allow it to. It also goes to show how much he lays down and sacrifices for the overall mission of protecting Gotham, which can play off of the difference between him and Prometheus throughout this main story, as Batman is willing to give up everything, and Prometheus, he's not really willing to give up anything, but he's lost his humanity. This would also add more impact to Talia's death as well, as we're able to see yet another lover of Batman not able to find any solace in a relationship with him, as they would be tragically affected by the Batman persona and his career fighting crime. Again, this establishes a lot of tragedy for the character, and it does help to add impact to that death of Talia al Ghul later in the series, albeit retroactively, and this helps tackle and add to the depths of Bruce Wayne as a character, as in these games outside of Arkham Origins and Cold Cold Heart, we are very often seeing the Batman side of Bruce Wayne. Yes, Bruce Wayne is Bruce and Batman, but we're very often just seeing him in his Batman state of mind, going after criminals, taking them down, and going through the main story of the game. I do believe that one thing Origins excelled at was adding humanity to Bruce Wayne, helping add those stakes and see him as a person developing over time. You see his relationship with Alfred, you see his relationship with Joker, and you see those things actually sort of culminate in a human place. It's the same thing with his very brief friendship, the start of a long friendship, but his brief interactions with Barbara Gordon in Arkham Origins. We start to see that humanity of Batman, and I think that that would very well play off of who Selina Kyle is. She's a character that's shown to have a ton of humanity, but really separate herself from other people to sort of avoid being hurt. And I do believe that there should be playable segments in this game that is non-existent, but I wish it was, for both Catwoman and Dick Grayson's Robin in the main storyline of the game, as I feel that the Bat family characters, they were often shown in the Arkham games, but they were neglected. Ironically, Gotham Knights seems to be going the complete opposite direction in its own continuity, focusing specifically on these characters that we rarely got to see in Arkham and not really focusing on Batman. But I would really like to see something with a middle ground. This is a little bit similar to something like GTA 5, where you have segments of the game that are very focused around Batman, as it is the Batman game, but you also focus segments around Selina Kyle's Catwoman and Dick Grayson's Robin. Finally, I would also love to have Jason Todd slowly becoming a son-like figure to Batman, especially near the end of the game. You could very easily introduce Jason Todd before or after Dick Grayson leaves, as he was not Robin for a little bit, but I do believe that Dick Grayson should leave by midway through the game, with Jason Todd being introduced shortly after. That's why when I talk about this, it's worth noting that I am interested in and open to, in my own pitch, the idea of, instead of playing as Dick Grayson's Robin, playing as Jason Todd's Robin later on in the story. Maybe he has to show up as Robin and he helps save Batman, and that's his first time as Robin, and maybe we don't play as Dick Grayson, but we instead include his storyline throughout the story in cutscenes and other stuff, and you have those two-player sections. They're technically one player, but where you get to play as two characters. Maybe that's your exposure to Dick Grayson's Robin. I'm open to either or. I think when I was talking about this, as a little aside, I didn't want to make the scope so massive that this was unrealistic, would be a $2 billion game and could never be made. But I do think you could do either or. It would be amazing to see both characters playable at different points in the game. They could also very easily reuse a bunch of different moves and stuff for them as well if they had to. But I just wanted to get that out there because it's something that I really struggled with when picking this of, do you want to play as Dick? Do you want to play as Jason? Do you want to play as both throughout the story and it changes midpoint, which is kind of what I lean towards, especially when rereading this. I'm getting off track, but this was very hard to write up. It's like 10 pages long. When you have Jason Todd becoming this son-like figure to Batman and you have Dick Grayson leaving midway through the game, this could also actually add a lot of depth to those relationships, sort of showing how Batman is in this hurt place, and he's not really trying to essentially just completely replace Dick Grayson, but one, that's how it kind of comes off to everybody, and two, there were tragedies and missed signs in the character of Jason Todd that, if caught, could have possibly prevented his death. This is a mistake that Batman made because he wanted to help take care of this kid and because he was also in a certain spot in his life. And this is something that does haunt Batman, just like all the mistakes that he's made. I think it would be very interesting to see that taking place over the course of the game. It's also worth noting that I would make this story longer than the previous Arkham games, as I believe one issue that these games had in the past was needing to cram up too much story into a very small space, like one night. I think it has been very difficult for Arkham Origins, especially because they had to introduce the origins of the connection between Batman and Joker, and because of that, many characters ended up taking a side position that didn't really matter that much outside of Batman. Joker, Bane, and Gordon. Those were kind of the four that really mattered, along with Alfred having a central, weighty position on that storyline. Most of the other characters had to sort of stay to the side and move around, as they didn't really have enough room to do much with them in the primary story other than just kind of showing them in some side stuff. By making the story a few hours longer and also pushing the character to engage in secondary activities like crimes, collectibles, and side missions, I think it would allow us, so when I say us, I mean whoever's actually making this, to flesh out the connections between all of these characters in much more depth, which then establishes a lot of much needed context for the remainder of the series. I also would have Alfred contribute to the overall plot again. I know that it does seem like I'm drawing a lot out of Origins, but I think it's important to do so that Origins is not so divorced from a lot of the rest of the series. Because he did have a huge contributing role in Batman Arkham Origins, but he was actually rarely seen or heard from in other games. He just talks to Batman a little bit over the cowl, over the communicator. He essentially was relegated to a very minor side character instead of showing up as the heart of Bruce Wayne that he often is seen as in the comics and animated continuity. This is Bruce Wayne's Jiminy Cricket to his Pinocchio. And to see Alfred in a similar role to Batman the Animated Series, where you can tell that this character helps keep Bruce grounded to some degree and also has a heart behind him, would be incredible, and it's one of the shining points that Arkham Origins was able to provide to players. Including a redone version of the Batcave and the mansion would really help with this too. Think of a hub where Bruce encounters different characters that he meets throughout the story, but who are very clearly on his side and in on the secret identity of who he actually is. You could have Jason Todd residing there in the mansion or in the Batcave for the latter half of the game. You could have Dick Grayson here for the first half of the game when he's not with you. You could have Barbara and Alfred in this area where you interact with them. You could have Selina Kyle show up. Having each of these characters have their own social interactions with Bruce and also with each other as they move throughout the mansion and Batcave would also provide a sense of organic life and livability to the world, where you feel like you do have an actual place here. But that place is slowly being stripped away and made more hollow as these connections between Batman and certain characters like Selina Kyle or Dick Grayson are sort of peeled back and frayed throughout the course of the story. I also do believe a Batcave would be another place to add to the mythos and history of Batman and Bruce Wayne. This does sort of encapsulate the idea if you had a connected Wayne Manor and Batcave, where you could walk around as Bruce Wayne in the manor and Batman in the cave. I think it would be really interesting to see this develop over the course of the game. Say maybe you beat a certain enemy and you get an item from them. I'm just throwing this out here because I didn't actually decide to put this in the game, but let's say, for example, if you were to fight Mr. Freeze in this game, just as a pure example, and you beat him and you took his freeze ray gun, and say that gets set up actually in the Batcave. I think it'd be very similar to what you see in the GCPD evidence lockup, where you could essentially build up almost a character trophy collection over the course of the game, while also doing the same with the Wayne Manor. Maybe you have Batman add on to it over the course of the game, similar to something like Assassin's Creed with the Villa. The sky is kind of the limits here. This is something I'm very open to in my own pitch, because I've always wanted to see a connected Batcave and Wayne Manor, and I think that a big portion of what I'm going for in this game is duality. It's sort of that duality of Bruce Wayne and Batman. We don't just focus on one because they're both the same person. They are both who he is. And I think that it's very interesting to see both sides of this character actually show up in this game and get a lot of support. When it comes to game mechanics, I could keep going on and on about my potential story and my personal made-up canon for this, but I think it's worth talking a little bit about the gameplay, as this is a video game, and that's one thing Arkham excels at. I would want to make sure that the combat is as smooth and as fluid as it is in something like Arkham Knight, but without breaking the lore. For example, I do think that some people thought Arkham Knight was a little too fast, and I do think that some people preferred the slightly slower version of that combat in something like City or Night, and I would kind of want to strive to go back to that. I would not actually have multi-fear takedowns in this game. They're an interesting concept in Arkham Knight, but it's very easily established early on that Batman is able to do those because of the new tech that Lucius Fox put in the Batsuit. He would not have that in this game, therefore we should not actually be, bouncing balls to the wall like the Flash, as if he does have that technology that he would not have access to yet. This is a big problem with a lot of games that try and serve as a prequel, is that they try to evolve the gameplay further, and sometimes it ends up breaking canon or lore of what a character would be able to do at that time. I'd be very, very careful to actually focus more on things like stealth sections, similar to how they were able to do it in a game like Arkham Asylum, but being able to tie the first half of this game with Dick Grayson in a handful of these scenarios in as well, so that you could have both Batman and Dick Grayson's own conflicts, like say there's a portion where you play as Dick or a portion where you play as Bruce, and also later on with Jason Todd. Again, it's something that the scope of is pretty big, and that's why I would be open to either or. This would make it feel unique and different without just being a copy of Batman Arkham Knight, but it would be very obvious that it would take place far before that in the time period while still being fluid. This game should definitely take place over the course of, at minimum, a few weeks, and this should not take place over the course of the day. And I understand why this was done in previous games to allow fluidity between side missions, but there needs to be a way to progress time through the story to show these social interactions changing and happening. You don't go through tons of tragedy and have all your social interactions and connections and people you care about change in one night. That's not really something that happens to people. It's not very human. Usually when it comes to these relationships, friendships, and partnerships, things change at more of a slow burn that does not happen within only 12 hours. I would also have the Batmobile actually make a return, except there would be no battle mode. None. No tank. And I'm not knocking Knight for that, but the reason for this is because it was a big complaint from a lot of players, and this game takes place years and years before that. It would be a little silly to essentially have Jason Todd have this outdated knowledge of Bruce Wayne's car, saying, oh, it's a souped up car that has a lot of weapons, and then people are surprised it's a tank in Night if he was driving a tank back then. Again, it's one of those things that breaks canon and lore, and I think would be a little dumb. So my version of the Batmobile would involve chase sequences like the ones that you see in Arkham Knight, which is where I personally think that the Batmobile really excelled, where you would chase down different criminals, and it would also be a very efficient way to get around. I do think that it would help to use this to include certain puzzles at points where you need to use the Batmobile, but I would only do it a handful of times in the game versus chaining the player to the Batmobile for a ton of the riddles or whatever we're looking at with the puzzles. It should be used intentionally and sparingly, as you would use any gadget that you would use to solve a puzzle or progress in previous Arkham games, and I think that people would have had a lot less problems with this in Arkham Knight if it had been a bit more sparing, but still been included in the game. This would also help with the lore as well, like I said, because he hadn't created that battle mode at the time. Every playable character in this game should have their own combat style without confusing the player, and this is something the Arkham games have been able to do surprisingly well without just reskinning Batman as every character, but they've also struggled with at times where a lot of these characters don't have the gadgets or all of the moves that they should have access to be very viable and playable characters in things like challenge maps. I would want to change that. This would very easily also include that team up mechanic from Knight, while also tying into the overall dialogue and story between Bruce and Selina. Essentially, this game is very much about the connections between Bruce Wayne and the people around him, and how those connections are so easily strained, severed, and also changed due to his time as Batman. I also would not have Gotham City be evacuated yet again. I do feel like this is something that was very overdone in previous games. I understand that there were more reasons for it, and also it was done to keep people off the streets so that you didn't have to have a massively crowded city with Batman and company, but I do think that this game could actually benefit from the inclusion of civilians, and it's been shown in something like Insomniac's Spider-Man or Miles Morales that this is a doable thing in a superhero game, especially in modern times. Considering that Batman moves slower than Spider-Man, it could actually be even easier to get these civilians out of his way by the time he gets to them, as you would not have to stress the tech of the game by loading in massive amounts of civilians as you progress through the city at an extremely fast pace. Batman can move fast, but he can only move so fast. He's still a man with technology. This civilian aspect also does add to the connections between Batman and other characters and humanize Gotham City, as I believe that just creating a vacuum with only Batman, a few other vigilantes, and an abandoned city with criminals does a bit of a disservice to Gotham City as a city with a personality. There are real people in Gotham who have real problems, and though he does keep a low profile and tries not to go around like Spider-Man hanging out, doing high fives and taking pictures with people in the streets, Batman does occasionally have to engage people in conversation or tail a civilian or interfere with a crime where a civilian might get hurt, and this is also where a lot of the Batman as a symbol of hope ideology comes in, is his interactions with these civilians and the brief glimpses they get to see of this character. Civilians not being included limits potential player engagements to only being with criminals, and I feel like that's a missed opportunity in previous games that I would not want to repeat in this one. This inclusion of civilians would also allow for the inclusion of Jason Todd to be easier. You could very easily have Jason and Bruce meet in a situation like this, have Jason start by stealing the wheels off the Batmobile or attempting to, do something else slightly criminal or be interrupted by Batman in some other way. I think this would be very interesting and a cool way to introduce the character and start the connections between the two, where you see Bruce Wayne see Jason Todd as this kid in trouble who needs a home. And I also believe that having Jason suit up as Robin either near the end of the game or at the end of the game would be fantastic to see, as he could then be included in the challenge maps for this game, and also maybe eventually have his own DLC where he is trying to prove himself as Robin following the story of this Arkham Origins sequel. This sort of reaches the end of my pitch of this game, however not quite. I do still want to cover a couple things, including more villain side content and DLC content that would play into this game, but this video is getting very long and I'd like to kind of cap it off here and ask you what you think about my pitch. Would you be interested in playing this game? Would you not? I'm very interested to hear your thoughts. Again, I know that it's very easy to pitch a game versus make one. I am not blind to that. I'm not a complete idiot, although I may act like one. This is not something that I expect to be made. This is not something I expect to ever make, especially because I know that fan games are basically beaten down with the force of God, because God forbid anybody is passionate about what they like. And I do know that it would be much, much harder in practice to do this than it is to talk about it. Although, talking about it hurt, my voice is going. We will be having a part 2 to this game to wrap up those last things that I want to talk about. And then in the near future, I will be talking about my other pitch that I find interesting. But please let me know what you think in the comments down below. Please let me know if you enjoyed this, if you didn't, what your thoughts are of this overall pitch, and if you'd want to play this game, or if you have any ideas of your own that would play into what I talked about. I actually am very interested. Fan interaction with these properties is probably my favorite part. I think it's what makes them special and important. And I think that once you cross over into being something so big in the public consciousness, it's important to get people's opinions on things like this. So please let me know what you think. Subscribe for more content, leave a like. Thank you so much for sticking it out to the end, guys. And before we go, I do want to say that if you are interested in helping support the channel, hitting that subscribe button and the like is always helpful, but we have other ways as well, including our special, wonderful Etsy shop run by my wonderful, gorgeous wife, Jill, where she actually makes all kinds of really cool jewelry and other stuff for people of all ages all backgrounds, all walks of life. It's a lot of cool stuff, and we do have the newer Martha collection over there. If you're gonna ask why I said that name, it's very simple. I said that name because it's all kinds of really cool jewelry. It's that time of year. I always say that. I don't know what I mean by that, but I'm sure you have a loved one in your life who could use something nice, and it goes to help support the channel. So the link is in the description down below, along with our super new, super rad Discord server, like I mentioned before. Hope to see you there. Have a fantastic day. As always, everyone, stay shway.